Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. We're going to talk about the victims who get hurt the most in pretty much every kind of crisis. Children. And here's an aspect that surprised me. Most of the children around the world who are caught up in a crisis are not in a crisis caused by war. And the children we're talking about aren't just in Africa and South America and Asia. They're in America, too.
Our guest today has run innovative programs to help children around the world, along with their families. She is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and does analysis of these problems for policymakers. Hopefully they'll listen. In addition, she runs a nonprofit that has used an unorthodox approach. They get children themselves to tell international aid officials, here's what children need. We'll actually hear some of those kids in this episode on video. But first, please welcome Sweta Shah.
Hi. Hi, Danny. Hi, Dave. Great to be here.
And I should add right away that in the interests of full disclosure, that you are my daughter-in-law.
And Sweta is the co-founder of ChildArise, which she and her colleagues describe as a nonprofit giving voice to children in crisis. So maybe the first thing we should hear, Sweta, is tell us, how big is this problem, really?
The problem is really huge. It's bigger than you would think. There are millions and millions of children. I mean, we don't have exact numbers because it's actually so large. It's everywhere around the world. I've been working in the humanitarian sector and have been an advocate for young children in crisis for over 20 years. Investment into humanitarian crisis is insufficient. Investment into children in humanitarian crisis is virtually nil when you compare it to the needs of children.
It sounds almost ridiculous to say this, but when people talk about wars or floods or wildfires or pandemics, they often neglect the fact that roughly half of the victims are children. And yet the officials who decide how to help them often think of them as, well, numbers, statistics, even though children have needs that are very different from adults' needs. Their brains are developing. So if kids are hungry or stressed or sick or all of the above, it can damage them in ways that last for the rest of their lives.
And I just want to throw in a few more statistics from reading your papers and your colleagues' papers. The average refugee situation, meaning, refugees who we see in tents or whatever, frequently lasts 17 years. That blew my mind. I was thinking, okay, for a year or for 2 years.
Yeah, that's amazing, really.
That's a great statistic to include. And when we say crisis, we're not talking about just conflict or war, which often people think of crisis, but we're also talking about impacts of climate change, which,
yes,
as we know, are increasing exponentially. And for the foreseeable future, we're likely to have even more displacement due to climate. We're also talking about children in crisis due to even something like divorce, poverty, homelessness, that can also put them in crisis.
Well, I was just going to ask you to linger for a little bit longer on the climate change issue, because I think that's something that a lot of people don't really grasp. That is the impact of climate change on children. What happens to them?
Okay, I'll give one example of a place where climate change can impact children in ways that people don't really realize. So in a number of places in Africa where you're seeing droughts now, that's an impact of climate change. And the result of drought is that you don't have nutritious food, which children need for their physical and brain development. Another example of the impacts of climate is just displacement. Children who have to leave their homes due to floods, due to fire, due to many different types of disasters that happen.
So the natural disasters that are stimulated or exacerbated by climate change create crisis for kids in the places where they live, but also motivate families to migrate, to leave, become refugees, right?
Absolutely. Each family wants to ensure that their family can survive and thrive. And when that is no longer possible because of climate change or other risks that are there, they have no choice but to leave. And we're seeing more and more of that happening. People being displaced and leaving their homes due to climate issues.
The UN estimated in 2019, 20 million people were displaced globally because of extreme weather events.
Yeah. In the Middle East, you're seeing huge heat waves, children dying. It's so hot. We're seeing impacts of air pollution on children's lungs and brains. And in fact, air pollution has even greater impact for young children because their brains are developing and their brains are more susceptible and their brains are smaller. So it's going to have a bigger impact than for an adult during a really critical period of brain development.
And that means long-lasting cognitive impairment, doesn't it? I mean, this is not something that just can be erased if they get to breathe clean air or suddenly get to eat nutritious food. This is a long-lasting problem for them.
There's also evidence that it's not just impacts on the brain, but the impacts on the brain then impact also physical health. And so we've seen situations where children who are in huge air pollution, like New Delhi, like Mexico City, actually have irreversible damage to their long-term physical health as well.
While we're on the subject of climate change, I want to mention a statistic that I read in one of your papers. It said that 88%, almost 90% of the burden of climate change, that was the word that was used, falls on children under 5. That kind of astounded me.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because during the first 5 years of life, you have about 90% of brain development that happens. Now, the brain does not stop growing throughout life. Even, you and I, our brains are still developing and we can still learn and we're still growing.
Well, I'm 82. I don't know about that. It might be developing, but in the wrong direction.
Dave, I didn't know you're that old.
It is. No, in fact, the brain keeps developing. But what a lot of people don't know is that the first 5 years, first 8 years of life that we call the early childhood period is the most critical period for brain development, meaning the most number of neural connections can be made. That doesn't mean that other periods of life are not important, but if you can get the early years right, then a child can be set up for not only surviving but thriving and succeeding in life. So this statistic that comes, Danny, is really because so much of brain development happens during this period. So any impacts, positive or negative, can have a really long-lasting impact.
I'm so glad you're talking about this because I've been very frustrated by a lot of the coverage in the mainstream media of food deprivation, of starvation, because it all is about, hunger at the moment or death, of course. People starve to death, but there's very little in the mainstream media discussing this issue that you've just highlighted. That is the critical period of brain development, which is the last 2 trimesters of pregnancy, the first 2 to 3 years of life, and the long-term, lifelong consequences of this. We hear about Gaza, for example, and the Israelis not allowing sufficient food into Gaza and children, going hungry. I mean, just even putting aside the crisis of the war itself and that long-term impact, just imagine what this means for a whole generation of Palestinian kids who are in Gaza and suffering from this semi-starvation and lack of nutrition to help their brains develop.
And I think we keep seeing in the news, hearing on the news that, UN officials warn that X number of people and children are on the verge of starvation. And then when we see the relief trucks coming in, I think there's a general feeling, thank goodness, they're going to get food and they're going to be all right. But what you're telling us, Sweta, is that even if the children are getting food, what they've gone through already may have made permanent impacts on their brains and development.
Absolutely. I mean, all of these shocks to children's lives are cumulative. And so children, if they don't have nutrition for a period, it is going to impact them. They also need to have safety and security. Mentally, they need to feel safe and supported and loved. And children in Gaza right now are missing out on all of these, nearly all of these. Disruption in children's lives is really big. Children need a sense of normalcy and routine. You may recall you're both grandparents. You know that, like, for example, small children, they love to read the same book over and over. It's boring for us as adults, but for them, it gives them a sense of safety and um, support and normalcy. One of the major assaults of climate change, especially if it ends up displacing a family, is that they lose their normal routines. And when children are separated from parents or other caregivers, which often happens in a climate crisis or other types of crisis, that is huge. So those are some of the assaults.
Now, let me just follow up on the safe environment issue, because early in your career, you worked in some places helping set up safe spaces for children, Darfur refugees, for example. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so many years ago, I worked with Darfur refugees in Chad.
And this was a war, we should point out,
Yes.
that they had fled from.
Yes. I worked in Chad in refugee camps for Darfur refugees on the border of Chad. This part of the country was arid, semi arid, so very sandy, very hot. It was regularly over 50 degrees Celsius.
I've been there. It looks like desert. I mean, I felt like I was in Bible times.
Yeah.
Camels could have been walking through.
There were camels actually and donkeys. So when you think of very dry, arid conditions, that was where we were. There wasn't a lot of water, there wasn't a lot of vegetation. So in these contexts, the first thing that we want to do is to make children and families feel safe. We want to make sure that they have the very basic needs, food, water, clothing, blankets, a place to sleep, and food to eat. We want to make sure that we can provide a safe place for children to go back to their normal lives.
So what did you do? What did you put together?
We established programs all throughout the camps. They were called child protection programs, and we created what's called child-friendly spaces. What that looks like really is just a tent made of plastic where we just had a safe place for children to go. We set up mats, we put in toys, and we just provided that space. Initially, we often want it to just be free play, so it's not very structured. But then over time, we really created a schedule and a curriculum that really goes into the area of guided play. So in Chad, for example, we had children, they experienced bombing in their villages. And so they're very traumatized by seeing airplanes. So when we had them in our child-friendly spaces and we would give them paper and crayons or color pencils, children on their own were just drawing images of planes with bombs and fire. They were processing this because they had seen this. One time when we were at a child-friendly space and we were playing soccer outside with kids, a UN plane flew over. They didn't know it was a UN plane. And that just reignited their trauma from their village where they saw airplanes dropping bombs and they ran inside the child-friendly space because they were so scared that that plane was going to drop a bomb on them.
It's just horrifying. I want to just insert one thing, which is that there was a study of Syrian refugees during the horrendous massacres in Syria and the civil war there. 45% of the children studied showed post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. We could go all around the world and quote these statistics.
So the fear that children, the trauma is really hard to really overcome. But when you use things such as free play, such as sports, such as music, such as dancing, such as art, it gives children an outlet to be able to start processing some of these issues. And critical to that are peer relationships. So one of the other reasons why we have child-friendly spaces is to enable children to rebuild social connections with each other.
This whole thing you've been talking about, child-friendly spaces, sounds in some ways almost so obvious, that you should have to, create something like that after a disaster, whether it's a wildfire or a flood or a bombing. But what you've and your colleagues have written about for years now is that aid programs often don't think about that stuff.
Yes.
It seems like that it's down at the bottom of the list of issues, right? I mean, food, shelter, sanitation, security, but child-friendly spaces don't get the priority that they really deserve.
Yeah, anything that's focused on children usually is at the bottom, the absolute bottom.
It's really odd, isn't it? I mean, we claim as human beings to love our children and care about them, but we don't put our money where our mouths are. So just to remind everyone, we're talking with Sweta Shah, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and a co-founder of the NGO ChildArise, which, as I understand it from talking to you many times about it, tries to give voice to children. I mean, after all, we hear adults talking about kids, but the kids don't really get heard very much directly.
Yeah.
And we started off talking about the fact that many times officials who design and carry out aid projects don't really think of kids. They're a statistic, Dave, as you put it at the beginning. And Sweta, this is one of the things that you've really pushed in all your work is it's time to ask the children themselves, how are you feeling? And what do you need to feel good?
So this issue of child voice and child participation is core to my work at Brookings, but it's also something that is core to the nonprofit that I co-founded, ChildArise.
And what inspired you and your colleague to form ChildArise?
We've been, as a community, as advocates, humanitarian advocates, as child advocates, we've been trying to increase investment into children in crisis. And we found that the traditional approaches that we were using, which was going to UN events and having panels, they just weren't working, usually because children's voices were not there. So we don't always know really like what is the perspective of young people. And because children don't vote, nobody cares about them.
And when you say the panels and everything weren't working, you mean they weren't convincing the people who need to hear what children want? They weren't reaching those people and convincing them, hey, you've got to change the way you design these aid programs.
And it wasn't moving the needle in terms of increasing funding for young children. We didn't want to use the same old approaches that have been tried and tested and have resulted in basically nothing.
It's a good point because you need the human component. The abstractions are important to understand academically, but not until you get to hear actual real people do you feel moved. And I think that's probably true for policymakers as well as ordinary folks. You just need to hear the actual voices of the real people who are in these situations. And that's what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah. We wanted to do something creative, different. We wanted to put children in the driver's seat, in the middle, in positions of power. We wanted to put ourselves as adults in their positions. I mean, if you imagine a 3-year-old walking around, they're going to see things in the world that we do not see. They're also going to experience things very differently. Many people feel that, especially young children, that we don't really need to involve young children. We don't need to hear their voices because they're too young to really have ideas. But that's totally false. Even a 3-year-old has ideas. If we were to listen, they may not be able to articulate their ideas in the same way as an older child or as an adult, but they can articulate their ideas through play, through role play and drama, through music, through drawing. And so that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to use these playful approaches to help young children share their stories with the world.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Osmaili Sofía, vengo de Venezuela y tengo 12 años. Mi nombre es Chantal, vengo de Venezuela.
And that's an excerpt from one of the videos we're about to hear, where children share their stories about the world.
And Sweta, can I summarize? You were working with families who had emigrated from Venezuela to Colombia. Some were trying to make it to the United States. You had a project focusing on their children called If I Could Tell the World.
And you titled this video,
It's called Sueños en Ruta. That means dreams en route.
Dreams en route.
This title actually was co-developed with children themselves, with Venezuelan migrant children and families that are currently in Colombia.
Essentially fleeing from Venezuela.
And they're fleeing from Venezuela because of the economic and political situation, which made it really difficult for families to raise their children.
And you basically asked children on camera, what have you been going through?
But we should tell our listeners that you didn't ask children directly to answer your questions. You used a rather interesting approach, what you called an avatar.
Yeah, we didn't actually ask them, what was your experience? We asked them to create a toy, a doll, and then we said, what is this character's story? So they're talking about their own experience through the avatar. So the children were not speaking, this was my story. They were saying this was Recolester's story. That was one of the names of the dolls that was created. Recolester means recollection. They named it like recollecting stories, basically. So the kids actually designed this themselves through, workshops.
And what ages were the kids?
Between 4 and 12, mostly.
Recolister es un recolector de historias que toma una forma diferente.
So here are some excerpts from the video. As you can hear, the kids are all speaking Spanish, so we have a translator who just happens to be Sweta's daughter.
My granddaughter, Priya Shipler.
Yeah, you have a lot of talent in your family. And the video starts out with a child asking the other children, why did you have to leave your home?
¿Por qué le tocó salir a Recolister de su casa?
Por situaciones complicadas. La situación del país.
For complicated reasons. The situation in the country was bad. Also, the economic situation was bad.
¿Qué fue lo más difícil para Recolister durante su vida?
And then the questioner asks, what was the most difficult thing for Recolister during her journey?
Que habían muchos obstáculos.
There were many obstacles. There were people who, because of her situation, didn't want her around. They rejected her, treating her like garbage.
Que vio a su mamá ahogándose.
She saw her mother drowning.
Why is it important to get the children talking about some of the scary aspects of their trip? They're not going to go to therapy, clearly.
No, they're not going to go to therapy. And we know that even mental health support, not only in the United States, but everywhere in the world, is grossly insufficient. So the idea was we wanted to get them talking about their stories, their experiences. So a lot of it was to enable them to process the trauma that they experienced and their emotions. So by talking, they were processing what they were experiencing. We don't want to re-traumatize kids by asking them directly, because actually asking a young child to talk about, one of the kids talked about his mother almost drowned in a river, right? So asking him, tell us about like your mom almost drowning, that can be a trigger for children. We didn't want to trigger children. So we said, okay, well, what happened to Recolester, or what happened to so-and-so? And they used the avatars. They were still telling their stories, but they weren't saying, I had this experience, my mother almost drowned, but so-and-so's mom almost drowned, or so-and-so, this happened.
So fictitious characters and dolls and toys had the experiences.
Yes. And so using play and using storytelling is just a wonderful approach to enabling children to not only process what they're experiencing, but to start healing from that.
And speaking of healing, you and your colleagues used this approach to help the children dream up strategies that could help solve their problems. As we're about to hear, the solutions are fanciful, but they're also touching and revealing.
El invento que yo hice se llama Reina Arcoíris.
The invention I made is called Rainbow Queen, and it can take you to all the places you'd like to greet your family. Well, my invention is called Wish Fulfiller. It fulfills people's wishes because I know that many kids face a lot of problems. So this device works like a printer. When it listens, it can create whatever they wish for.
Ejemplo, tú necesitas un paraguas.
For example, if you need an umbrella, you simply say it, and it provides you with an umbrella. or another solution to your problem.
O sea, ya llega a un país, pero los policías le dicen, no, no puede pasar
For
porque no tiene los
example,
documentos.
when they arrive in a country, but the police tell them, no, you can't pass because you don't have the proper documents. This mission works by providing those people with the necessary documents to help them so they can cross into different countries.
Todo lo que necesita, por lo menos agua, comida,
And the balloons give them everything they need, like water, food, and toys.
Sweta, who do you want to hear these videos and watch them, and what do you want them to learn from them?
As I mentioned, the overarching project is called If I Could Tell the World. So yeah, we want the general public to understand the experiences of these children, and maybe that will create a level of empathy among the general public. Maybe it'll result in the general public wanting to individually give to such programs in the future. We also want policymakers to really think seriously about the impacts of these kinds of crises on children's lives and think about policies that can improve their lives.
So the videos you've done under the rubric of your NGO, ChildArise, your other hat that you wear, the bigger hat in a way, is with the Brookings Institution. And there you're working on issues that deal with children, not just overseas where we've been discussing their problems, but also inside the United States. What issues are you seeing for American children?
Unfortunately, the situation for children around the world is pretty dire because they're just never prioritized. So what we're seeing with the United States, it's not changed much. It's just unfortunate that what's happening currently with the administration is going to potentially negatively influence children's lives going forward.
Yeah, some of them care about children in utero, but not after birth. Can you focus on problems that some American children have that mirror some of the problems of crisis that we've been talking about among children overseas? I mean, malnutrition is one. I mean, there are malnutrition clinics in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the nutrition issue is really, really critical.
In fact, Dave and I did an episode a couple of years ago with a doctor who runs a malnutrition clinic in Boston. And she sees children who mirror the horrible problems of infants in places like Africa. You know, children come in who are 2 years old, but they look like infants. They're so malnourished. And by the way, the U.S. government doesn't really have solid statistics on children like these. For instance, a report by the Agriculture Department suggests that somewhere between 800,000 kids and a few million kids, big gap, were food insecure, that's the term, during a recent year. Right? That's the term, Dave?
Food insecurity, exactly. That's what it is, food insecurity. The problem of poverty in the United States is that families, and I looked at this when I did my book, The Working Poor, some years back, and nothing's really changed very much, is that families are faced with lots of very fixed expenses that they can't cut. So they've got to pay the rent. They've got to pay the utilities bill. They've got to make the car payment because most people need cars to get to work. The part of the budget they can squeeze is the food part. And so housing costs are very high as a percentage of income for low-income people, which eats into the ability to buy sufficient food.
And, there's something that is called ACEs, that's adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences can be poverty, it can be divorce, it can be, separation from family, it can be lack of nutrition, it could be
it could be violence too, I suppose, right?
Violence in your community, it could be a disability. And when children have children are very resilient, but when they have multiple ACEs, as we call adverse childhood experiences, they're at greater risk of experiencing toxic stress. Toxic stress is really dangerous for children.
So what is toxic stress?
Toxic stress is actually a level where stress stays elevated for a very long time. So everyone experiences an increase and decrease in stress in their lives. And sometimes having increased stress is okay because that may be is a jump start to get you to do something. But when children's stress stays at a very high level for a long time, that actually creates changes in their chemistry, in their body. And that change in chemistry can have really long lasting impacts on their cognitive and physical health. So we are really concerned. So in the United States, there are many children that have numerous ACEs, and so they're at higher risk of toxic stress. And that's the same as in refugee contexts.
Well, I'm thinking, for example, of children in the Southeast, like in North Carolina, which had those horrendous floods. People's homes were destroyed. Children in California, which had the horrendous wildfires.
Or children in violent neighborhoods where some of them feel they have to take guns to school or stash them on the way to school if they can't bring them in, so they have protection as they go home. It's an aspect of life that does, overlap in some cases with the experience of kids in crisis overseas.
Absolutely. And children from single households, single mother or a single father kind of household, or children that, are staying with their grandparents, or children who have no caregivers. So there are a lot of similarities between children in the United States and children in Ethiopia or, Syria.
What are the solutions? I mean, we're in a period now where a new administration has come in and they've just decimated the USAID and all these programs that are helping people all over the world. And then what's the flip side of the coin? What do we need to be doing? I mean, we always needed to be doing more than we were even when we were doing something. But now, it's really a disaster, it seems to me. And what needs to be done to really address some of these problems of children in crisis?
So, all of us have known that reform was necessary, that there were some inefficiencies within the system that, could be streamlined. Yet the approach that's been taken by this current administration, where things are being cut and slashed without a thoughtful process, is really been detrimental. So we already are hearing about, if we're talking about the United States, we're already hearing about Head Start, programs that are being shut down because they're not getting the funding that they need.
The program for toddlers and young kids.
Exactly. They're not getting the funding they need to pay their staff or even to pay the bills for, the buildings where they're providing support. So this is creating a huge panic for many families who depend on these kinds of programs. All of a sudden, these programs close without much notice, and families are scrambling to figure out, how can I actually get to my job when I have a toddler to take care of? It's having a huge impact. So we have longitudinal data that indicates that investments in early childhood programs, which could include Head Start, the evidence is very clear that when you invest early, you can get the best bang for your buck. There's also evidence that indicates that children, the more vulnerable the child is, meaning the more ACEs they have or the more challenges they have, the more they benefit from these programs as well. So it's really devastating to see all these, programs being cut.
So, Sweta, given this scenario, nightmarish, I think, is a good word for it, what can you start doing to try to solve some of these problems? I mean, obviously, we could have 100 episodes on solutions, but in the few minutes that we have left, what are you and your colleagues in the United States and around the world going to do now to try to address children in crisis, especially given that the money is drying up?
Well, we're doubling down. We're not taking the funding cuts to mean that we're giving up, because we're not. This is the time that we actually need to double down and really advocate and push for the things that we believe are important and where we have evidence for things working. I think one of the areas where the international aid sector has already been thinking about is a terminology called localization, which is to have, not to depend on international aid, but to actually uplift and support local efforts. So, for instance, some of the work we're doing is supporting at a mayoral level. So the mayor of Addis Ababa is doing great work for children.
In Ethiopia.
Yeah, and also in Istanbul, Turkey. Like there's some really phenomenal local government officials who are championing children and children in crisis. And so we are refocusing on supporting local efforts.
But may I interject? I like what you're saying in theory, but I find it hard to believe that mayors in developing countries and other local officials are going to come up with the money that children need when they're surrounded themselves by so much poverty.
I think in the financing piece is always there, the challenge. And so we're also thinking about how can we really tap into the private sector. Obviously, we have to really we have to be very careful in also working with the private sector because we don't want any one funder to basically be the one to tell us what to do or tell communities.
So dominate. In other words, you want to depend on a variety of sources, not while everybody's learned the lesson from depending so much on the U.S. government, it really can go bad.
That is going to require us to double down on our efforts, is going to require us to really think outside the box creatively of solutions that come from the local level, from the state level, from a city level, from a village level. It's going to require us to really think hard about various financing mechanisms that could come from the private sector, that could come from individuals. So if we're talking about children in crisis outside the United States, we know that there's significant funding that comes just from the diaspora that send money to their home country.
Oh, you mean people who go abroad to work and then send money back to their families?
No, I mean more families that are immigrants here in the United States. They're citizens, but they're from another country, and they'll send money to an NGO in their country.
Uh-huh.
That's also an untapped area because people often want to know, well, I'm from India. Do you know about schools in India that I can help? I went to Uganda, and I am so shocked by the conditions for children in Uganda. Can you recommend organizations? So I think the trend is going to be more focus on local level, whether that's U.S. local level or in other countries. How do we support local efforts and how do we support local organizations? Donors now need to take a risk. They need to be willing to take a risk, give to local organizations that are, whether they're locally in Maryland or locally in Uganda. They need to take a risk knowing that some of these smaller organizations, they may not do the best work. It may take them a while to have the best quality program. There might be some waste, but at the same time, when they get it right, it's going to be much more sustainable, it's going to be much more relevant, and they're going to be able to scale faster.
Well, that's really interesting. It sounds as if there might be a silver lining to this sudden scarcity of government funding if the local organizations, which one assumes, are, there in the grassroots and understand the local problems better than the international people who are parachuting in and imposing their templates on aid, can, maybe really make a difference and make the dollars that are available go much farther than they have been. I mean, is that just too Pollyannish, or is that a possibility?
I mean, we have to keep dreaming, Dave. So I think that's the trend. I mean, my belief is always that whenever you crash and burn, you can only go up. I think that there is a silver lining to this. I think you have to believe that there's a silver lining to everything that's happening. This is a moment in time now where we as humanity need to think of a different path from what we have been used to. We need to reimagine our future. And despite all the challenges that humanity is facing, that we're facing in the United States, there's always hope. I believe there's always hope to find creative ways around this. We can make it happen.
Sweta Shah co-founded ChildArise, which is a nonprofit giving voice to children in crisis. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution based in Washington, D.C. Sweta, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, this was really wonderful. I'm so proud to have you as my daughter-in-law.
Thanks so much for inviting me, both of you. This was really fun.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.